Steve Fettig, live on a ranch southeast of Bismarck, North Dakota, about 90 miles from here, closer to Napoleon. Live on the north end of Beaver Lake. So my brother and I took over from our dad in 1981 and kind of went for a few years with that and had farm loans, paying 20% interest on some of our farm loans back at the time, and things were pretty tight, and looked at different options to try and increase income, and found an article on Alan Savory and holistic management. And in that article he talked about increasing your herd size without increasing any of your land base, and that intrigued me. So I looked into getting into a seminar with Alan Savory, and came home with a plan after that to make better use of the land resource that we had, just to increase our income without increasing expenses. The Savory course was held up here in Bismarck. It was in 1986, the fall of 1986, and Alan himself came and taught the course, and was interesting, along with overwhelming, on what we were going to try and go home and implement to make things work. So when my brother and I took over the ranch, I could see that there was different areas in the ranch that were underutilized. We weren't using them to their full potential, and yet there was other places we were overusing too much. So my thought process was, if we're going to increase the herd, we can definitely use those underutilized areas, and we could build off of that and start getting our herds combined from 3 herds into 1 herd to better utilize the grass, yet give it a better recovery time. Yeah, there was a lot of growing pains. One was the water developments. You definitely don't have enough water capacity off a windmill that pumps 1 to 2 gallons a minute. So we had to figure out how we were going to increase that expense, increase the water development expense, but yet make it pay with the increase in cattle. And the other thing was making sure that the forage base was there for a large herd. We went from 180 cows in 1 herd. We built the herd up to 400 cows. To develop our water, we had to pretty much abandon the windmill systems, and we started putting some electricity to the closer wells that we had, and putting in submersible pumps. That was fairly simple to do and fairly cheap for the amount of bang for the buck with that. And then we had to increase the amount of storage capacity on the water tanks. The 10-foot galvanized tank didn't cut it anymore. We had to use go to a fiberglass tank that would hold 2,000 gallons and plumb 2 to 4 of those together. So we had an 8,000 gallon reservoir for the cattle to drink. Then as things developed, we started drilling more wells, adding pipelines to different areas in the pasture to get the water to the cattle, instead of having the cattle walk all to the water source, and creating trails and putting the water closer to the cattle got them to utilize the far away areas a lot better. We noticed that in probably year 3 that we were definitely getting a better utilization, meaning we were using the hilltops where the cattle weren't going before. They were coming up out of the valleys, and they were going up on the hilltops to graze some of those areas. They were going a little further away to graze those areas too. And then the regrowth on those areas was a much better forage. We were getting away from the Kentucky Blues solid stands, and getting more of the natives back into those areas. And it was just a better quality forage because it was green. It wasn't leftover grass. I always use the analogy, nobody likes to eat the last loaf of bread because it's hard and dry, you know. If we could get that forage eaten off and have new regrowth come back, it was better utilized the following year. So when we transitioned from Dad's operation, and my brother and I We were crop farmers. We had about 900 acres of cropland that we were farming, wheat, barley, and oats. And as we built the cow herd, my dad cut a lot of prairie hay, and we were getting away from the prairie hay because we built the cow herd up, and we were using those prairie acres to graze the cows, so we were seeding more alfalfa. And so we cut back on the grain farming quite a bit with the alfalfa acres. And then as we got into the drought of 1988 and 89, and we were cutting the crop for hay, and we just decided, what's the point in trying to be crop farmers when we're more of a land base that's better utilized for grass. So we seeded, over time we seeded all the cropland acres into hayland, and then we were cutting hay and feeding the cows. And then as we transitioned from the cow herd base into a yearling operation with custom grazing, we ended up selling the haying equipment and just grazing all the acres and not using anything for hay anymore. We just grazed everything. Water placement is a big issue. And then trying to divide up the pastures. At the time, we were cutting our pasture size down from somewhere as large as 320 acres, and we wanted to get those pastures into a smaller acreage so that the cattle would better utilize those areas. At the time, back in the 80s, barbed wire was pretty prevalent and still is today, but we made the transition from barbed wire to a single wire electric, and that seemed to work out pretty well. With the single wire poly and a step-in post, you can arrange your pastures in a number of configurations versus putting in a semi-permanent or permanent single wire hot wire, which works really well. But the planning process in having water placement and fence placement is really critical. One thing we noticed almost immediately was, of course, the regrowth from the grass. And then after that, it was moving the cows on a shorter grazing time frame. We were moving them ahead of the fly hatch, so we didn't have quite the fly problems like we were having in the past. The other thing was when you're working with your cattle, they tame down a lot better. They're used to seeing you. They're used to coming to you to be moved. So your stockmanship becomes a lot easier. It becomes just a much easier way to work your ranch with tamer cattle. Another benefit would be just being able to plan where you want your cattle to be at a certain time of the year. I've used the analogy before that if you've got a wedding or grandma's funeral to go to, you need to know where your cattle are going to be while you're gone, and they have to have enough feed available to them at that time to be able to stay until you come back. So the planning process, although it looks intimidating, becomes very easy once you get into it and you understand what your thought process is going to be to get your cattle from point A to point B throughout your whole grazing system. Yeah, we put a grazing plan together. I actually maybe oversimplified it. I just take a calendar, regular calendar, and we've got a map of the farm layout, the pasture layouts, and I determine where we're going to start the grazing season at a predicted start date, and that'll change according to the grass growth and what your spring grazing season starts out as. And if it looks like I'm not getting close enough to the fall pastures that we want to be into, I'll have to go back and replan that. A better way to do it, and Alan Savory was one of his talking points, was you plan it backwards. If somebody's going to get started in moving towards a better grazing system, I would encourage them to get a hold of a mentor out of the Grazing Association and go and visit with them, see what works for them, and basically see what didn't work for them. The planning process should be walked through with a new person, learning the ins and outs of water placement, fence development, that type of thing. and then also learning the process of regrowth, grass recovery times, and the shortened grazing periods in those areas would be a big thing to learn. And then also, what's the goal of that person starting their grazing system? Maybe you don't want to be a daily mover, you want to be a weekly mover, so you want to determine what your goals are for that and the labor requirements you have available. So after the July heat and dry periods that would come in, and that was kind of a problem coming back into those pastures on a twice over rotation. So we switched over to a once over, and we were utilizing the grass down to probably about some areas they'd take it right to the ground, but majority of the time they'll just graze the tops off and leave those areas. Now in our pastures, we've got some grass that doesn't grow more than 4 inches tall, and they'll just take it all the way down to the ground in one bite. But in the other pastures where you've got grass that grows a foot, 2 feet tall, they'll just skim the tops. And you have to develop an eye for it, and that takes a while to do that. But don't be discouraged by that, because it'll come to you, and you'll develop an eye for being able to know how much forage you're going to need for your animals for a day, 2 days, a week. If you have moisture, you've got a lot of growth there, and there's green undergrowth, and the cows can balance their diet basically a lot easier with tall growth and shorter undergrowth. The twice over, their diet wasn't as balanced, and we noticed that going into those shorter regrowth pastures. They weren't content, and they were always walking the fence looking for something to balance their diet with. They were too high in protein and not enough carbohydrate in their diet. And once we went to a once over, and the diversity in forage was available for them, they were much happier, much more content. They weren't rushing the gate to get to a new pasture. They were more settled. They were calmer to move. Don't be intimidated by a grazing system. We actually look forward to it from year to year to see what we can do different, how we can change our plan from year to year. The exciting part is seeing the regrowth come back on that grazed areas. And if you tend to overutilize an area 1 year, give it a little more recovery time the next year, and it'll actually rebound in a better way. But the big thing is, don't be intimidated by it. It's something to look forward to. It's always fun and exciting. Seems like a lot of work at the time, but if your thought process is to increase your income potential without adding more land, a grazing system is the way to do it.